Gentile, one in Messiah, one in Yeshua, one in the olive tree. Jew and Gentile, one in Messiah, one in Yeshua's love.
Greetings, my friends. All prophecy fulfilled. Welcome again. We are in a series that I've titled Gentiles, Christianity's Best Kept Secret. And I believe I promised you how we were going to get into Romans chapter 1, and we're going to kind of hold that up against Hosea chapter 4 so we could see exactly which Gentiles are in view in Romans 1. And I think I said that I would prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that the Gentiles in Romans chapter 1 are the very same Gentiles that we see in Hosea chapter 4. In fact, that's really just the prediction of what Hosea prophesied. And I'm going to get to that. I will explain to you how Israel exchanged their glory and essentially became Gentiles. And those are the Gentiles in the New Testament. But I got a little bit distracted. Bear with me on this. I'm going to get to that. I really am. And we are going to get into Romans 1 today, just not really how I thought. I got to thinking about context. You know, everybody talks about context. And, you know, pastor gets up and he starts preaching a message and he says, hey, let me give you a little context. Romans chapter 1. Paul is writing to Gentiles in Rome and how there's a new covenant and it's for them and that now they're included. And you know what, folks? You and me are included in this covenant. And then he starts preaching. It's not really context, you know? Context is so varied, and there's so many kinds of context and in different forms of context, and it's almost like if you're going to have a message on Romans chapter 1, you really need to have an entire message on the context of Romans chapter 1. But nobody really wants to take the time to do that, and all I hear is lip service about context. Well, you're not saying that in context. Well, according to context, you know, he's talking about this. And I thought, you know what? I'm going to take time out here and let's talk about Romans chapter 1. Let's contextualize a little bit the Jew and Gentile, or the distinction between Jew and the Greek, as Paul puts it. So, yeah, context. Okay, look at, simply put, generically put, really what that is. Context is the information accumulated along the way within the story itself, okay? Right here, within the story right here. That is relevant to the story and informs and influences our reading and interpretation of the text that is right before us. Okay, so what we call contextual considerations really should be like, and it should serve as like a bookshelf of information, okay, that we have access to as we read. And we've accumulated this information as we've come along through the story. That provides contextual considerations. And sometimes I refer to what I call contextual clues within the text itself. In other words, for example, Romans chapter 1. As we begin to read, I think that there are just all sorts of contextual clues or hints that really serve as reminders, okay, or signs that point to what we've already read before, that what has come before this, and that sign is saying, hey, listen up. Do you remember that? Okay, well, that is connected to this. And then the question becomes, how? How is it connected? And I think part of the problem is, as I mentioned last time, is that we tend to walk right into the New Testament, you know, as if the slate is just wiped clean, right? Okay, we push aside the story of Israel under law that's taken up like 3/4 of our Bible, and we just kind of push it over to the side. We kind of disregard it, right? And I think what that does is when we disregard it, we kind of, maybe even subconsciously, kind of push it under the rug and say, okay, let's start over here, Matthew. Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, right? And I think it makes it so easy to disregard the obvious. And I think what it does is that kind of causes us to engage in what I like to call this tunnel vision exegesis, where we can only see what's in front of us. And man, when we do that, we just see what we want to see. And I think that's what happens in Romans chapter 1. People come to it, and I think maybe even unconsciously, they've severed it, Romans chapter 1, from the Israel-centric underpinnings of the story, with the assumption of what we've all been told, right? We've all been told the new covenant, it was a new thing for all humanity. So the Gentiles in Romans chapter 1, well, that's just everybody and anybody, you and me, that's us. That's not it. As I've said many times over, the failure in understanding the Jew-Gentile distinction, it springs from a failure to recognize that the dichotomy, it's not a broad brush stroke, between two groups within all humanity. It's between two groups within all Israel. That's your contextual confines right there. The division is within the covenant world of law. You see, the entire redemptive story, it's founded on, it's predicated on the premise that Israel would be split and it would become all Israel united again. That's it. So kingdom split, kingdom divided, kingdom united. There's your story right there. A divided house would become one again. A broken covenant body, the old man in Adam, in Moses, that body would become a new man in Christ. In short, Israel redeemed. That's the story. So yes, Paul has Gentiles clearly in mind in Romans chapter 1. But if we're going to be honest, if we're going to be consistent with the biblical context, that is, what is within this story right here, the information within the story itself, you know what? We better admit, we should admit that Paul's view of Gentiles, the goyim, the ethnos, right? It can be none other than the view established by the long line of Israel's prophets. It has to be. Israelites made Gentile, made goyim, their pagan children, if you will, last lesson, right? Through covenant breaking and their subsequent scattering. Now, a lot of people say, well, why would you think that Gentiles are Israelites? Well, my question to you and to everybody else is, why wouldn't I? Why wouldn't this be the view when the only Jew-Gentile contrast within the context of redemption, right there, because it's Israel's redemption, within the context of covenant gathering, there's your covenant confines, it's the very same distinction made by the prophets. That's why Paul's view would be the same as the prophets, and that was the contextual confines. That was the story. And we would do well to remember this contextual backdrop as we prepare to run through Romans chapter 1. Let me just demonstrate, okay, how there's all sorts of what I call contextual clues within the text. And if we're tuned in, if we take note, if we're honest, if we're consistent with this, I think we can see these things for what they really are. They're signs pointing us directly towards Israel's redemption. All Israel, both Jew and Gentile. But which Gentiles? And that's what I'm trying to get you to see. So I saw 6 of these bad boys, so 6 contextual clues. And I'm going to run these by you. Here you go. Number 1, right off the bat, in Romans chapter 1, verse 1 and 2, Paul mentions the gospel. Well, we all know what the gospel is, right? Well, no, I'm afraid we don't. The gospel of God was promised through the prophets. Now, we've talked about this. the good news and the bad news via the prophets, right? I've talked about this just ad nauseum. The good news was always, and I mean always, it was laser beam focused on the last days gathering. And the only people that could be, we could contextually connect, right, to the last days gathering, prophet after prophet, were only those who had been scattered. That's just a contextual fact that we ran into every single time. Those of Israel would be gathered time and time again. It's always the gathering of the elect of Israel. Those who were far, those who were near. Now look, there's so much more that I could say about the gospel. Man, so much more. Like the time frame of the gospel. And it would reach, and it did reach, the whole world, right? Every creature under heaven, that kind of thing, according to Paul, before the end came. And I could mention how the mission could only extend until the end, because once the end came, the gospel had achieved its mission. Because that would be when the mission would be accomplished. And I could talk about how the gospel was for the remission of sins. Well, which sins? Well, the Bible says explicitly that it was for the remission of sins committed under the first covenant. Okay? But I'm not going to go down that rabbit trail. I've done that. In fact, you can go into my past videos and you can see lessons on specifically the gospel. So my point is, right off the bat, if we have our lens adjusted correctly and we see this gospel here, a good news, that should immediately bring to mind the only good news gathering the prophets saw, and that was the gathering promised to Israelites, to Israel. That's it. How about interpretive or contextual clue number 2? In verses 5 through 7 here in Romans chapter 1, okay? I've talked about the elect of Israel before. Israel was God's elect. Israel was God's chosen. And I have given many scriptures from the prophets that demonstrate that fact. And it's interesting to me that Paul tells these Roman Gentiles, right, that they, those who believe, were the called of Jesus Christ among the nations, the ethnos, the goyim, right? And called to be saints. Now, you know what this is? This is tantamount to being called God's elect, His chosen. God is calling these out of the nations, out of the ethnos, out of the goyim. You've heard this before, right? And again, through the proper lens and with the information that we've gathered along the way here, we can see how these being called out, according to Paul, receiving the gospel, the good news, which was Israel's gathering, right, through a new covenant, which was a long established theme of Israel's prophets, is being fulfilled by these elect, these chosen. But if we're consistent, we need to recognize, we need to admit that the only elect as specified by the prophets, the only chosen as specified by the prophets, were those with a connection to the first covenant, Abraham's seed, Israel. Israel was the elect. They were the chosen. They were the ones who would be called out of the nations. This was to whom the promises pertain to, and I've given many, many explicit statements that say as such. For example, Romans chapter 9. Right? To Israel pertain the promises, the covenants. So again, something in our head needs to contextually associate these Romans being called out of the nations with the message of the prophets, with what has come before it, which was the message that the cut off, dispersed Israelites, Abraham's seed, would be called out and gathered from among the nations. Do you see how consistent this is? Number 3, contextual clue number 3. In verse 13, Paul references, he says, I do not want you to be unaware, brethren. He calls these Romans, these Gentiles, brethren. Folks, brethren is not a generic term. It's used to describe the brethren of Israel. They were the family of Yahweh. Do you remember Jeremiah 7:15? I will cast you out of my sight. Speaking to Judah, I will cast you out of my sight as I have cast out all your brethren, the whole posterity of Ephraim. Genesis 49:8. Judah, you are he whom your brothers shall praise. Now look, the roots, and I would say the roots of meaning, or the roots of connotation of brethren, they spring out of the 12 tribes, the sons of Israel. Okay, the 12 brothers through whom the family of Israel came from. It's a familial term, like a clan or a household, right? God's household, God's family through covenant was Israel. The family began with Israel. It began with the 12 sons, the brethren of Israel. That's the term right there. Remember when Peter said, 1 Peter 4:17, for it is time for the judgment to begin with the family or the household of God, right? And if it begins with us, what will be the outcome for those who disobey the gospel of God? Now, I kind of think he actually has two different peoples in mind, Jew and Gentile. But which Gentiles? Well, the us here, Peter was a Jew, and judgment was coming down on the Jews and their city. There's no doubt about that. But judgment was also coming to the nations, to those in the nations who would disobey the gospel of God. Well, the gospel of God was going out to the nations, to the goyim, to those of Israel who'd been scattered. That was the judgment. So no, not all nations on planet Earth, but the goyim. The nations, those in the nations who needed and qualified for redemption, and that was Peter's audience. They heard the gospel, but some rejected it, right? Just like their Israelite ancestors, right? So yes, the entire family, the household of God, all Israel, if you will, Jews and Gentiles who rejected God, who rejected that first that new covenant. And that would include the dispersed pilgrims who were hearing that message, Israelites. They would be judged. Judgment, biblically speaking, is always contextually tied to law, and only Israel had Yahweh's law. The judgment of the goyim, the nation, it's always tied to law. Always. The law brought wrath. So look, what I'm saying is, what I'm getting at here, I'm talking about brethren here. Peter was not only reaching out to Jews who were near, right? But he was also reaching out to the lost sheep, those who were made far. His lost, cast out brethren. He was fishing for his lost brethren, the same brethren, really, that Jeremiah 7:15 referenced. Think about it. The brethren reference is a clue. It's a contextual clue here in Romans that is pointing us towards Israel. And no, it's not like, oh, he's a Christian. He's my brother in Christ. We have taken that and we have Christianized that. And that's not the intent. The brethren were the brethren of Israel. How about interpretive clue number 4? This is kind of weak, but I noticed it, and I think even if it doesn't in itself prove something, we are building a cumulative case. I've said this before. It's just piece after piece after piece, evidence after evidence. Now, here's a little something. It may not mean a whole lot by itself, but I think it adds to the case. In Romans chapter 2, and again, I'm going to go into Romans 2, 3, 4. I'm not just going to, these clues are spread out throughout. But in Romans chapter 2, verse 1 and verse 3, Paul uses this interesting little phrase. He says, "Oh man," where is it here? "Therefore you are inexcusable, oh man." right? Whoever you are who judge. Oh man. Now, you're not going to see that in some of the translations. For some reason, they don't put that in there. But you know what I think this is? I think this is a Jewish phrase. I think it's kind of like a Jewish idiom, maybe. I'm not sure. But we see this in the prophets from time to time. Micah 6:8. He has shown you, O man, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you but to do justly, love mercy, walk humbly with your God? Isaiah 22:17. Indeed, the Lord will throw you away violently, O mighty man. So you got this "oh man" kind of thing going. 2 Kings 1:9. And he said to him, O man of God, the king says, come down. And I see Paul using this elsewhere. Romans 9. But indeed, O man, who are you to reply against God? And in 1 Timothy 6:11, he says, but you, O man of God, flee these things. So he kind of does what we see there in 2 Kings. James 2:20. But do you want to know, O foolish man, that faith without works is dead? So, again, not really powerful evidence, but what I'm saying is when we see these things, these Jewish-sounding phrases or idioms, it's pointing us back to the prophets that came before us. And these are things that I think the audience would have been more aware of than Joe Blow pagan out there wouldn't have really made these connections. But you know what? Dispersed Israelites would have. Or at least they would have been more likely to. Okay, moving on from that one. That one was kind of weak. How about interpretive clue number 5? I find it interesting that in Romans 1 through 3, after he kind of finishes off this diatribe, if you will, this teaching on Jews and Gentiles, he kind of begins this new thought, I guess you could say, but it's not really a new thought, but it's a new flow, I guess. And how does he really begin this? Well, in Romans chapter 4, verse 1, he says, what then shall we say that Abraham, our father, has found according to the flesh? Abraham, our father. Now look, I've talked about this before. Now he uses the phrase, our father, numerous times elsewhere. Here's a fact, Jack. Fact and Jack, that doesn't rhyme. The term father is just saturated with Israel history, Israel meaning, Israel connotation. Abraham was father to Israel. You're going to have a really hard time finding a usage of fathers that does not refer to the fathers of Israel. Like in, for example, 1 Corinthians 10, 1 through 2. Moreover, brethren, I do not want you to be unaware that all our fathers were under the cloud. All passed through the Red Sea, or all the sea. All were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea. How about Acts 7:45? Our fathers, having received it in turn, also brought with Joshua into the land possessed by the Gentiles. Acts 3:13, speaking of men of Israel. He says, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the God of our fathers. Matthew 23, that's a big one. I've talked about that a lot. He's laying into the Jewish leaders. And he keeps saying, your fathers, your fathers, your fathers. Speaking of their fathers, the fathers of Israel, and he's tracing Israel's fathers, and he's tracing Israel's prophets all the way back to Abel. Man, and that's just, it's devastating. Think about it. All these people that Paul is speaking to in his letters, all of them, their fathers were fathers of Israel. They have to be, because that's what fathers means. It's an Israel connotation. It's an Israel meaning. Their fathers were the fathers of Israel, and they knew it. And this only makes sense if Paul's writing to scattered Israel, for example, like in 1 Corinthians 10 that I just mentioned. Pagans not associated, having no connection with that first covenant, they wouldn't have had a clue what he was talking about. What do you mean, our fathers? Fathers of Israel. How did they pass through the sea? They were never part of that. No. Do you think pagans would have had a clue about Father Abraham? No. Abraham was not the father of pagans. He was the father of Israel. And that's a very, very, very important term. And we have to understand it. That is a contextual clue, as I like to call it. Okay, number 6. He says in verse 16, he uses the very common phrase that we're all aware of. He says, for I am not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it is the power of God to salvation for everyone who believes, for the Jew first, and also for the Greek. And then he uses that in 2:10 as well. So, again, I'll say it again. The distinction needs to be made within the contextual confines of the story that has gone before it. The Jews, law-practicing Israelites, and the Greeks, which is simply a reference to the Hellenized descendants of Israel who'd been assimilated into the Hellenized world. Those were the Greeks. I mean, come on. Think about it. I mean, isn't that really what the prophets foretold? That they would be assimilated into the nations, becoming the nations? Well, yeah, it is. Well, that's what we're seeing here with Paul referencing the Greeks. That's who these people are. We know that in a wider sense, the Greek included all nations, all peoples of that time and place in the world that made the language, the customs, the education, the culture of Greeks as their own. Now, whether that was by force or that's something they chose, doesn't matter. People, cultures, nations were immersed into all aspects of the Hellenized culture. And that included all aspects of life, like religion and worship practice. And look, all we really have to do is go back, 200-300 years, and look at the history from the time of Antiochus Epiphanes, okay? It is a fact. It is a fact that Israelites became Hellenized during that period. They adopted customs of the Greeks. They joined themselves to their Gentile ways. They forsook the law of Moses. And they, like the practice of circumcision, for example. We know that. And you know what? That jives with what we see in the New Testament. John 7:35. At this, the Jews said to one another, where does he intend to go that we will not find him? Will he go where the Jews are dispersed among the Greeks and teach the Greeks? This makes perfect sense. I think that, again, this just adds to the cumulative case. This sheds light on what's going on in Acts. It aligns with the prophets. It aligns with Israel's story. It's consistent. There were still dispersed Israelites living among the Greeks during the days of Jesus. These were considered Greeks to the Jews. These, in my opinion, were the other sheep that Jesus spoke of in John 10, I think it is. So, and we see the same thing, like, for example, in Acts chapter 6, which reveals that there still remained a distinction between the Hellenized Jews, who were alien to the commonwealth of Israel, right? And the native-born Jews who were practicing law. Acts chapter 6, verse 1. Now at this time, while the disciples were increasing in number, a complaint arose on the part of the Hellenistic Jews against the native Hebrews, because their widows were were being overlooked in the daily serving of food. So Again, really, the enmity between these two groups was an enmity that was caused by law. That's where the split occurred within that covenantal world of law, and that is where the reconciliation was going to come from a new covenant, if you will. So, again, look, I think you get the point, There's all sorts of contextual clues in the New Testament, and we have to read the text, and we have to filter these things through the story of the prophets. So when we see terms and phrases like dead in sins, like fathers, and stuff like that, we have to filter those through the story. And that's all I'm saying. And I keep saying it time and time again. So you know what? I'm sorry. I'm done. I'm going on too long about this. But it's strange to me how we hit the New Testament running as if it's just a brand new thing and it's totally severed and detached from what's come before it. And I'm saying, no. It is so irresponsible to do that. Romans chapter 1, as you will see next lesson, it makes so much more sense. It is so much more consistent. Everything that Paul says makes so much more sense if we see it in light of the Jew-Gentile distinction that is only within the distinction within all Israel. So, next time, I absolutely promise this time, I swear, I will get through Romans chapter 1, starting around verse 18, and we will see how Israel exchanged their glory for shame. And we're going to do that by filtering Romans 1 through Hosea chapter 4. And I believe that will clearly demonstrate that the Gentiles in view in Romans chapter 1, 2, and 3 really are undoubtedly the very Gentiles that Hosea saw or was speaking of in Hosea chapter 4. But we'll get there. That'll be lesson number 7. So thanks for tuning in. I know this was kind of a rambling lesson, but sometimes you just gotta do that, I guess. So anyway, we'll carry on. And thanks for tuning in. We'll see you next lesson. Take care. Adios.
Jew and Gentile, one in Messiah, one in Yeshua, one in the olive tree. Jew and Gentile, one in Messiah.